Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the sixth lecture of Comparative Philosophy of Death and Dying. In the previous lecture, we talked about first 8 chapters of the book of Job, and in this lecture, we will make a progress in this story. First, I would like to talk about the structure of the book of Job again, so that we will be able to see where we're going after picking up from the last lecture. Secondly, we will discuss the Retribution Principle. Remember, this is the basic thrust of the arguments that friends provide against Job. So we will see how they are developing this argument, or are they actually adding anything to the basic argument of the Retribution Principle. So we will see this in this section. Thirdly, we will talk about this conflict between happiness and justice. The book of Job, especially in relation to the discussion of the Retribution Principle, we started to ask this question of whether or not there is a connection between happiness and justice, or to be unjust, is it the same as being unhappy? So the Retribution Principle provides a certain outlook or the ethical view on human life and its meaning. So we shall see how the discussion between Job and his friends would touch this, one of the most important discussions in history of philosophy. Finally, as usual, we will end with concluding questions. So let's take a look at the structure of the book of Job again and see where your reading assignment for this class fits in relation to the whole thing. So the book of Job I discussed in the previous lecture has 4 parts. First part is the prologue, chapter 1 and 2. The second part is the 3 cycles with the friends. Remember, they started to talk about why is this miserable situation is happening to Job. So in the prologue, we saw the discussion between divine assembly and God, and among the assembly, adversary, the Satan, comes forward and talks to God. And, they discuss the nature of faith. What does it mean for human beings to maintain their integrity if their piety or being religious doesn't provide anything in their lives? So what's the point of being religious? That's the Satan's argument, right? Or he says that I question the motivations by which people remain faithful and religious and maintain a certain personal integrity just because they will be able to gain these worldly fame or wealth or great family relations and so on and so forth, right? So the happiness in this world is the reason by which people remain ethical and religious and trying to maintain their personal integrity. So that's what happens in the prologue. And then 3 cycles with the friends are left out of that prologue, and they're just trying to make sense of what's happening to Job. And then the third part is a dialogue with God. So Job is granted with this opportunity to directly talk with the divine absolute, and he will be able to actually ask the foundation of the universe, why is this happening to me? And then finally, you have epilogue where you see the consequences of this debate between Job and his friends, and also Job and God. Okay. So the first 8 chapters in the previous lecture covered prologue and some parts of the first cycle of the dialogue between Job and his friends. So let me take you through the more detailed picture of 3 cycles. So in this lecture, I have assigned you to read chapter 11 to 12, 14, 15, and 21 to 22. So where do they fit in relation to the whole thing? They fit in the 3 cycles with the friends, of course, because we're just starting from where we left in the last lecture. Now, the first cycle is between chapter 3 and 14. So we saw Eliphaz as leading speaker broke the silence. After 1 week of being silent, he said, would you be offended if I actually try to talk to you about what's going on? I cannot keep silent. Remember that? And then Job responds in chapter 6 and 7. And then Bildad adds argument to Eliphaz's leading argument, right? Now, Eliphaz's argument was more like a personal revelation. So I saw this spirit that talked to me. Also, he tries to talk from his own experience, and he's much more compassionate toward Job. Now, Bildad, as I argue, was more like philosophy professor, very rational. He's versed in traditional knowledge, so he quotes the wisdom of old generations, and he tries to give a logical structure to Eliphaz's argument and make a concise point against Job. And then Job responded in chapter 9 and 10. We ended at the Bildad's first speech against Job in the previous lecture. And in this lecture, we will start with Zophar's first speech towards Job. And Job's response is given in chapter 12 to 14. And so we will just only cover the chapter 12, the beginning of his response to Zophar. And then the second cycle starts from 15 to 21. And then the third cycle starts from 22 to 27. So as you can see, we will cover Job's last speech in the first cycle. And then Eliphaz's second speech in chapter 15, and then Job's response is given in chapter 16 and 17, but we are not going to cover this. And Bildad gives his response again in the second speech in chapter 18. We are not going to cover this. And Job's response in chapter 19. And Zophar speaks again at the end of the second cycle in chapter 20 in Job's response. As you can see, I'm skipping the second speech given by Bildad and Zophar precisely because they don't really add anything. You just have to look at the structure in which they have a dialogue and how they devolved into this sort of chaos. I think they started out with much more constructive argument, and then they eventually reached this impasse. They are incapable of having constructive arguments or trying to have a dialogue where they could reach to reasonable consensus or agreement. They just started to kind of yell at each other. You know, it started out with amicable discussions. I mean, the situation is tense. Eliphaz's care is still there, but then eventually things kind of fall apart. So you need to pay attention to the structure of the book of Job rather than the details of each chapter. And then you see how they disintegrate toward the end of 3 cycles. So I'm going to skip Bildad's argument in chapter 18 and chapter 20. Of course, you can skim through it. And it's very important for you to flip through the chapters, even if you're not assigned to read. You know, sometimes when you are assigned to read a certain sections and there are some sections in between those reading assignments, even if you don't read, make sure to flip through those pages. Sometimes some sentences stand up to you and you'll be able to use those sentences for your presentation or writing papers in the end of a semester. So I highly recommend you to flip through Bildad's and Zophar's argument, even if you are not required to read these sections. Anyway, so we are going to look at the Job's last response to Zophar at the end of the second cycle. So that's the second cycle. And then we will look at Eliphaz's third speech. So the beginning of the third cycle. He responds to the Job's last response in the second cycle and how he starts the third cycle. So in this lecture, you should be able to see how Eliphaz's tone changes from his first speech in chapter 45 and his second speech in 15 and then final speech in 22. And then Job's response to Eliphaz's argument is given 20 through 24, but we are not going to look at these passages in this lecture. Okay, it's not very difficult to find this table of contents or structure of the book of Job online, so make sure to search it and see how they're structured. You started to notice certain things if you look at the whole picture. So let's dive into the reading assignment, book chapter 11 to 12, 14 to 15, and 21 to 22 in the following. First, let's take a look at Retribution Principle. How Zophar and Eliphaz tried to develop the Retribution Principle argument in the end of first cycle, in the second cycle, and the beginning of the third cycle. Retribution Principle. So this is the argument provided by Zophar 1.0, his first speech. He argues this. So let's take a look at the passage in the book of Job. So this is Job 11. Then Zophar the Naamathite answered, "Should a multitude of words go unanswered, and should one full of talk be vindicated? Should your bubble put others to silence, and when you mock, shall no one shame you?" Do you notice immediately the tone is very condescending, right? That should these words spoken by Job go unanswered? Like, should we just ignore this? Like, are you guys sure that you just let this guy keep talking and just let him have the final word? That's not acceptable. Zophar comes in with much more vehemence, right, in his argument, or enthusiasm in his response to Job's emotional cry. Should he be proven right? Do you let him just have the final word and act like he was actually proven to be right? That's what he's saying in the beginning of chapter 11. And look at the tone in which he makes his argument. For you say, my conduct is pure and I am clean in God's sight, but all that God would speak and open his lips to you, and that he would tell you the secret of wisdom. For wisdom is many-sided. Know then that God exacts to you less than your guilt deserves. So the first two friends trying to figure out what's going on with the life of Job, and they trying to understand the misery, the cause of misery that he's going through. Now Zophar comes in and says, like, look, I think what you're going through is less than what you deserve, right? So he actually pushed Job farther into the misery. Know then that God exacts you less than your guilt deserves. Remember, Job lost wealth, family, reputation, and health. And one of his best friends comes in and says this, you know, evil and suffering that you're going through right now is less than you deserve, Job. This is the verse 5 and 6. Then he continues his argument. Can you find out the deep things of God? Can you find out the limit of the Almighty? This is the chapter 11, verse 7. It is higher than heaven. What can you do? Deeper than Sheol. What can you know? So basically, at this point, Zophar is putting divine transcendence so transcendent that we have no access to what's actually going on in that divine realm. In verse 13, if you direct your heart rightly, you will stretch out your hands towards him. If iniquity is in your hand, put it far away. And do not let wickedness reside in your tents. Its measure is longer than the earth, broader than the sea. If he passes through and imprisons and assembles for judgment, who can hinder him? For he knows those who are worthless. When he sees iniquity, will he not consider it? But a stupid person will get understanding when a wild ass is born human. So basically, in addition to the argument for the divine transcendence that is so far transcendent to our knowledge, that humans would never be able to understand what's actually going on about the judgment of the divine. But a stupid person will get understanding when a wild ass is born human. So basically, Zophar comes out and say, you're so stupid to think that you'll be able to understand what God actually thinks. In fact, if he speaks, probably you deserve more punishment. That's Zophar's argument. So you see, unlike Bildad and Eliphaz, they were trying to come up with some sort of positive ending to the story, right? So they said, you are wicked, that's why you're suffering from these miseries. Your unhappiness is caused by your iniquities. Your injustice is the cause of your own suffering. However, if you confess your sin and if you repent, God will be on your side. So Eliphaz and Bildad are much more positive, or at least their intention is good. But you see, Zophar's ending is quite negative. His talk is very short, but it's very, how should I say, pushing Job into his ashes, basically, right? He's just pushing him down. This is verse 13. If you direct your heart rightly, you will stretch out your hands towards him. If iniquity is in your hand, put it far away, and do not let wickedness reside in your tents. Surely then you will lift up your face without blemish. You will be secure, and will not fear. You will forget your misery. You will remember it as waters have passed away, and your life will be brighter than noonday. Its darkness will be like the morning. So, same dictum as Eliphaz and Bildad at this point, that if you turn around, you will be blessed. But the eyes of the wicked will fail. This is verse 20. All way of escape will be lost to them, and their hope is to breathe their last. So, conclusion of Zophar's argument again is very negative. So let's reflect on this dialogue between Zophar and Job, or the statement that Zophar actually makes. In terms of the content, there's no differences between what Eliphaz was talking about or what Bildad was actually simplifying Eliphaz's argument. Zophar is not adding any substantial components to the argument of the Retribution Principle at all, right? But what is he doing with his words? Sometimes you could just repeat the same word, but the words, they carry meanings, right? So they carry meanings that is more than just verbal. There's certain meanings that is much more existential, and in fact, it will count as a certain action. So what Zophar is doing to a person going through this unmeasurable suffering, right? Unimaginable misery the person is going through, and he says, you deserve more punishment than what you're going through. He's not asking for help. I mean, this picture of this person is actually asking for help, but Job is not asking for help. Remember, he's just sitting in the ashes and trying to go through the day and hoping that he will be able to die without losing his integrity. He's just sitting there trying to understand what's going on, but also trying to go through this suffering with dignity so that he will be able to pass to the other side. He's not asking you for any help. He's just weeping down. He's just crying. And then Zophar comes in and say, you deserve more punishment and you are responsible for your downfall. What kind of statement is that? What kind of meaning does that statement carry to a person who is going through a massive suffering? We have to think about this existential implications of a statement rather than the meaning of the statement at the literal level. What is this poetry given by Zophar is doing to the soul of Job? So if you take a look at the chapter 12, you immediately see what's going on. So the basic gist of the argument that Zophar provides at the end of chapter 11 is that no hope for those who refuse to repent like Job. You are hopeless, you are stupid, right? That unless you repent, and then you say that you don't even know what to repent for. You haven't even committed anything to confess. But that's bullcrap, and unless you actually apologize, you'll never be able to be on the right side with God. But remember, from the prologue, we all know that Job is on the right side. But these friends estimate that Job is on the wrong side because he's going through these suffering. Look at the Job's response in chapter 12. This is where he started to provide some interesting argument. They're both existential and quite philosophical. So let's pay attention to his argument. So chapter 12, he starts to provide counterexamples to retribution principle. Chapter 12, verse 1, then Job answered, no doubt you are the people and wisdom will die with you. But I have understanding as well as you. I'm not inferior to you. Who does not know such things as these? I'm a laughingstock to my friends. So first of all, Job argues against his friends that, look, I'm not inferior to you. In fact, what you're saying is absolutely meaningless. First of all, you're not telling me things that I don't know. Like, I already know all of that. I already know all of what you're talking about. And then even with that, I don't understand what's going on to me. And in fact, who doesn't know such things? Everybody knows your argument, but nobody will be able to actually understand what's going on. And most importantly, verse 4, I'm a laughingstock to my friends. So not only reputations and all these wealth and family he lost, but he became a joke. It's just the bottom of human existence. He's first of all expressing his disgust with his friends in verse 2. No doubt you are the people and wisdom will die with you. It's just, I'm disgusted with the way in which you responded to me. And then he says, I'm a joke. I'm no longer significant. In fact, I'm just something to laugh at. Who called upon God and he answered me, a just and blameless man, I'm a laughingstock. I might be a just man, but what is worth in our society, I'm just simply a joke to you all. And then he starts really interesting argument, right? In verse 5, those at ease have contempt for misfortune, but it is ready for those whose feet are unstable. Tens of robbers are at peace, and those who provoke God are secure, who bring their God in their hands. But ask the animals, they will teach you, the birds of the air, and they will tell you, ask the plants of the earth, and they will teach you. So in verse 5 and 6, Job insinuates that the maybe retribution principle is not absolute. In some cases, you see the wicked thrive, they prosper. With these observable examples from our daily life, I put a question mark to the absolute status of the retribution principle. And then he continues, but ask the animals and they will teach you, the birds of the air, they will tell you, ask the plants of the earth and they will teach you, and the fish of the sea will declare to you. Who among all these does not know that the hand of the Lord has done this? So entire creation recognizes the foundation of the universe. Right? There's some principle by which all these things are created, or all these things are ordered. And then verse 13, he says, with God our wisdom and strength, he has counsel and understanding. If he tears down, no one can rebuild. If he shuts someone in, no one can open it. If he withholds the waters, they dry up. If he sends them out, they overwhelm the land. With him, a strength and a wisdom, the deceived and deceiver are his. He leads counselors away stripped and makes fools of judges. He cuts through any social structure that puts certain values to things, right? So the social hierarchy is no use to the power and order of God, he's arguing. He uncovers the deeps out of darkness and brings deep darkness to light. This is verse 22. He makes nations great, then destroys them. He enlarges nations, then leads them away. He strips understanding from the leaders of the earth and makes them wander in a pathless waste. They grope in the dark without light. He makes them stagger like a drunkard. So he exalts this capacity of the divine transcendence to cut through any of these differences in the human realm. No one can match the might and wisdom and justice of the divine absolute. And even though you're not assigned to read this, let's just quickly look at these passages from Job 13. 13:1. Look, my eye has seen all this, my ear has heard and understood it. What you know, I also know, I'm not inferior to you. So Job continues like, I understand the secret of the universe, right? That I totally understand the basic conception of the world as created by this divine absolute, and I'm completely with you. I'm not inferior to you. In fact, God is so great that all these social differences are meaningless. I agree with you. As for you, you whitewash with lies, and all of you are worthless physicians. If you would only keep silent, that would be your wisdom. So Job basically saying that, look, all of your advice is completely worthless. Like, you are worthless physicians. You can't fix any of the problems that we're going through right now. And on top of it, he says, could you just stop talking? I mean, I'm reaching to the point. This is the end of the first cycle. I cannot stand this conversation anymore. Like, you are telling me things that I already know, and it's not solving anything. Could you just shut up and let me be? This is chapter 13, verse 12. Your maxims are proverbs of ashes. Your defenses are defenses of clay. great expression. Remember this. If somebody gives you a hard time with pedantic teaching, you could say your maxims are proverbs of ashes and your defenses are defenses of clay. Okay? So these are the passages that you should remember. Perhaps you could put in the epigram of your future book. That's a great expressions. Or you can counter someone who will give you these pedantic teachings in the middle of your suffering. And at the end of chapter 13, he says, one wastes away like a rotten thing, like a garment that is moth-eaten. So you have an image of Job just disintegrating at the end of chapter 13. And then chapter 14 gives you philosophy of death. 14:7, for there is hope for a tree if it is cut down, that it will sprout again, and that its shoots will not cease. But this is verse 10, chapter 14. But mortals die and are laid low. Humans expire. Where are they? So Job started to compare how things in nature always regenerate. If you cut down the tree, it sprouts again. There's always capacity to regenerate. But when humans die, where do they go? This is verse 14, chapter 14. If mortals die, will they live again? All the days of my service, I would wait until my release should come. Verse 18, but the mountains falls and crumbles away, and the rock is removed from its place. The waters wear away the stones. The torrents wash away the soil of the earth. So you destroyed the hope of immortals. Like Gilgamesh, like Enkidu, Job recognized this mortality of human existence. Right? Once you die, we do not come back. And all the things that we've done on earth wiped out, and I'll never be able to communicate with the living. So how the living know what I have done? So this is the end of chapter 14. You prevail forever against them, that they pass away. You change their countenance and send them away. Their children come to honor, and they do not know it. They are brought low, and it goes unnoticed. They feel only the pain of their own bodies, and mourn only for themselves. So living can only talk about for the living. Dead people, we don't even know. They don't speak to us. Like there's no communication between living and dead, according to Job. So there's no way for us to make sense of any of this. Like we are bound to die, and once we die, none of what we have done matters. Really, almost like a despair and existentialism at the end of chapter 14. Why the despair? It seems that the book of Job insinuates that what makes us put in this position of despair or hopelessness is because death separates us from the living or the beloved. Once we die, we will never be able to communicate with the people we love, the people that are actually living. So this major separation brings us to despair. That's the end of chapter 14. And then reading assignment chapter 15, Eliphaz speaks and argues that Job actually undermines religion. So let's take a look at Eliphaz's second argument in the following. Then we will take a look at this separation between happiness and justice. The Retribution Principle tried to combine them and make them equal. Happiness and justice are the same. But the Job's argument is that the world is set up in such a way that we see this disjunction between happiness and justice. So we will see these two arguments in the following. First, Eliphaz's second speech. So the second cycle starts with Eliphaz's speech just like the first cycle. And then remember, the friends represents reason. They're trying to reason with Job to understand what's going on, right? Like we don't understand why this greatest man in the East is going through this most miserable experience in human history, right? We want to understand. So the friends come out of their compassion, travel from really far away. They travel a long distance to meet their friend. And then they try to reason with Job, but then reason turns into really abusive language. Let's take a look at the second cycle and Eliphaz's second speech. This is the beginning of chapter 15, verse 1. Then Eliphaz the Temanite answered, should the wise answer with windy knowledge and fill themselves with the east wind? Should they argue in unprofitable talk or in words with which they can do no good? But you are doing away with the fear of God and hindering meditation before God. For your iniquity teaches your mouth, and you choose the tongue of the crafty. Your own mouth condemns you, and not I, your own lips testify against you. So Eliphaz basically argues that they look, as a leading speaker again, to Job, you are just east wind. What does east wind mean? Remember, this is a kingdom of Edom, located in the border between Israel and Jordan in the present day. What's in the east from that location? It is just a desert, right? So it's a desert wind that comes from the east to the west. What does that mean? That means that wind is so hot that it could destroy any crops, anything that is living. That wind can destroy living things. So it symbolizes destruction and loss of life. But at the same time, it has this great image of hot air, You're just full of hot air that just do nothing but just destroy things. So you could say to your friend that are making really meaningless argument in the same way as Eliphaz, you can say that you are just producing east wind. Right? Really biblical response to someone saying meaningless things, right? So you are full of hot air. Let's read on chapter 15. Are you the firstborn of the human race? Were you brought forth before the hills? Have you listened in the counsel of God? And do you limit wisdom to yourself? Is that you are a single individual that do not have access to the counsel of God. You just this worthless individuals that do not know anything about the world. What do you know that we do not know? What do you understand that is not clear to us? The gray hair and the aged are on our side. Remember, Eliphaz argues that the traditional wisdom is on our side. And this is verse 12. Why does your heart carry you away? And why do your eyes flush so that you turn your spirit against God and let such words go out of your mouth? What are the motives that they can be clean, or those born of woman that they can be righteous? God puts no trust even in his holy ones, and the heavens are not clean in his sight. How much less one who is abominable and corrupt, one who drinks iniquity like water. So even the divine assembly or the heaven is not perfect like God as the absolute. So how much less one who is corrupt and unrighteous? He's arguing. So you are worthless to talk like that. And then verse 17, this is a crucial sentence. I will show you, listen to me. What I have seen, I will declare. Remember the beginning of the first cycle? Eliphaz was much more compassionate. He said, would you be offended if I talk? I cannot keep silent. Remember? His very humble position. He was sitting with his friend for 7 days and 7 nights. Remember? But now the role is reversed. He actually puts himself higher than Job by saying, I'll show you, listen to me. So it's almost like a teacher telling students like, okay, you need to calm down. Let me talk. You need to stop talking. You can see the hierarchical structure between Job as the greatest man in the East and his friends are turning to the other side. So we are the sages that giving you a counsel, and you are the wicked that going through this suffering. So what's going on in this chapter 15? Eliphaz continues to talk about the fate of the wicked. From the verse 17 to 30, he repeats the same argument. The wicked should suffer and the righteous should be blessed. From the verse 17 to 30, he repeats the same argument that the wicked would suffer. And then verse 31, so this is 15:31. Let them not trust in emptiness, deceiving themselves, for emptiness will be their recompense. It will be paid in full before their time, and their branch will not be green. They will shake off their unripe grape like the vine, and cast off their blossoms like the olive tree. For the company of the godless is barren, and a fire consumes the tents of bribery. They conceive mischief and bring forth evil, and their heart prepares deceit. Basically, chapter 15 ends with this negative note, just like Zophar's speech. They are no longer recognizing the possibility that Job might be righteous. They can't comprehend the possibility that retribution principle might be wrong. Chapter 16, Job continues to argue for his innocence. And then chapter 17, he prays and says, in the beginning of chapter 17, he said, my spirit is broken, my days are extinct, the grave is ready for me. I'm just dying. Right? Surely there are mockers around me, and my eye dwells on their provocations. And then end of chapter 17, he said, where then is my hope? Who will see my hope? Will he go down to the bars of Sheol? Shall we descend together into the dust? This is so hopeless. I don't know how to respond to these accusations, but just giving a prayer. And Bildad in chapter 18 argues the same point that the God punishes the wicked. Pretty much the same argument he provided in the previous speech, but it's much shorter and he's much more, almost you can feel that he's just really irritated by this. Like continuous argument that we know that we are right and Job is not really understanding us. In chapter 19, then Job answered to Bildad, how long will you torment me and break me in pieces with words? Right? So the words could actually break someone into pieces. These 10 times you have cast reproach upon me, are you not ashamed to wrong me? And even if it is true that I have erred, my error remains with me. Why do you have to make things worse by telling me what I have done, and even though I know that I haven't done anything? So why do you have to torment me with these words? This is chapter 19, verse 19. All my intimate friends abhor me, and those whom I loved have turned against me. My bones cling to my skin and to my flesh, and I have escaped by the skin of my teeth. Have pity on me, have pity on me, all you my friends, for the hand of God has touched me. Why do you like God pursue me, never satisfied with my flesh? what is really happening here is that these friends are incapable of giving up this idea of retribution principle, such that the only ways in which we can make sense of the situation is to frame the reality into their understanding of the world. Therefore, turning this blameless, righteous man that going through a horrible suffering into somebody wicked. You see the blameless and righteous person who didn't commit any sins going through this suffering. The only ways in which we can make sense of this situation is just turn this guy into evil, turn this guy into a guilty one. And this is often called confirmation bias. What is confirmation bias? Confirmation bias often happens in humanities and social sciences papers, that when we actually give a bad grade to these papers, one of the reasons could be confirmation bias. It's something like you already know the conclusion before you start reading it. So you already have a framework in which you want to read certain events or certain stories or certain philosophical texts. You already holding on to one position and you're not entertaining the possibility of otherwise. So let's say I'm convinced that Job is wrong. Therefore, I'm going to go into every details of his speech with this bias, with this conclusion. So you already made this conclusion to your argument, and then you're just picking and choosing the evidences that actually fit with bias. Okay, so your entire argument is biased, and in fact, if you pay attention to the comprehensive picture of reality, your argument doesn't hold, but you present reality in such a way that you can actually hold on to your ideological framework, basically. This happens all the time in our society. In fact, I will talk about this later, but sometimes the society is set up in such a way that we hold a certain bias, certain one-sided judgment on things. In fact, racism or ethnocentrism or misogynies and any kind of isms has a tendency to do this. So Job is torn between these confirmation bias, and then he says the solution to this confirmation bias, that you're trying to frame me into someone wicked and evil before God, just have a pity. So this is Job's response to the problem of confirmation bias. But once you have a pity, once you cultivate compassion, you'll be able to actually combat yourselves from holding on to this confirmation bias. You don't have to always believe your idea. At worst, you can give a benefit of doubt. At best, try to be compassionate to the person that's telling you certain things. Of course, in a legal system, that's not how it works, right? Retribution principle has to be held much stronger in a legal context. But in a conversation with your friends, if your friend said that I didn't do this, and there's many episodes that might insinuate that he or she has done it, have some pity. So do not fall into this confirmation bias. In fact, this story is a clear case in which the protagonist is actually in the right, and then friends are in the wrong. But because of the confirmation bias, we are right and you're wrong. Therefore, Job, you gotta be wicked. You gotta be evil to go through this suffering. And then Zophar's speech in chapter 20 continues this retribution principle again, and he's getting really, really irritated. This is chapter 20, verse 4. Do you not know this from of old, ever since mortals were placed on earth, that the exalting of the wicked is short, and the joy of the godless is but for a moment? Even though they mount up high as the heavens, and their head reaches to the clouds, they will perish forever like their own dung. Those who have seen them will say, where are they? Zophar continues the same retribution argument. And then this is a reading assignment, Job 21. Job provides these counterexamples to combat retribution principle or undermines retribution principle. Remember we talked about this in the Epic of Gilgamesh? The great philosophy papers would have to always provide examples. And examples would have to be insightful enough to prove the premises and conclusion. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, for instance, we saw how Ishtar tried to seduce Gilgamesh, and Gilgamesh cultivated reason after slaying of the Hambaba. He'll be able to provide examples to combat all these arguments. Remember that? Here, Job is doing the same thing like Gilgamesh. So let's take a look at the Job 21. Then Job answered, listen carefully to my words, and let this be your consolation. Bear with me, and I will speak, then after I have spoken, mock on. As for me, is my complaint addressed to mortals? Why should I not be impatient? I'm not talking to you. I don't have any business with you. My problem is with God, not with mortals. He says, verse 5, look at me and be appalled, and lay your hand upon your mouth. So you notice the friends are not really looking at Job because they're trying to frame him into their own image of reality. They are trying not to look at him in his eyes, right? Look at me and be appalled. When I think of it, I am dismayed, and shuddering seizes my flesh. Why do the wicked live on and reach old age and grow mighty in power? Their children are established in their presence, and their offspring before their eyes. Their houses are safe from fear, and not wrath of God is upon them. Continue. They spend their days in prosperity. This is verse 13. And in peace they go down to Sheol. They say to God, leave us alone. We do not desire to know your ways. What is the Almighty that we should serve him? And in what profit do we get it if we pray to him? Is not their prosperity indeed their own achievement? The plans of the wicked are repugnant to me. How often is the lamp of the wicked put out? How often does calamity come upon them? How often does God distribute pains in his anger? How often are they like a straw before the wind and like a chaff that the storm carries away? So why do the wicked live on? If the retribution principle is absolutely applicable to every part of human life, it should not be possible that the wicked prosper. In fact, Job might argue, the world is set up in such a way that the wicked, the really truly wicked person, will present himself as righteous, right? In such a way that he will be the most successful and most praised, most reputable person in the world. The more wicked you are, the more capable you are of repackaging yourself as the righteous person. So we wouldn't be able to tell which one is actually righteous and which one is actually wicked. In fact, sometimes, as you actually see in this story and many biblical stories as well as Socratic beginning of philosophy, the just person is often regarded as unjust by the majority of society. If the world is set up in such a way that the retribution principle holds all the time, this should not happen. That's Job's argument. In fact, a wicked person thrived in this world and there's no punishment against them. They are in fact very capable of thriving. And then continue to go on to talk about this interesting existential observation. Verse 23, one dies in full prosperity, being fully at ease and secure, his loins full of milk and the marrow of his bones moist. Another dies in bitterness of soul, never having tasted of good. They lie down like in the dust, and the worms cover them. Again, he argues that death brings equality to those who are good and bad. And what's the point of holding on to these distinctions if end of the day is all equal to both good and bad, right? Good and evil are treated equally at the end of our lives. In fact, evil often enjoys prosperity in this life. What's the point of that retribution principle? Even though it might be true in many cases, it doesn't always hold. That's Job's argument, right? And then he continues his argument in verse 27. Oh, I know your thoughts and your schemes to wrong me. You're trying to frame me here. For you say, where's the house of the prince? Where's the tent in which the wicked lived? Have you not asked those who travel the roads, and do you not accept their testimony, that the wicked are spared in the day of calamity and a rescue in the day of wrath? Who declares their way to their face, and who repays them for what they have done? Oftentimes, unjust person did horrendous things, they can get away with it. Or sometimes we actually convict the person who did nothing, right? We are seeing this social phenomena around the world. We see this everywhere in the world, right? So if you travel far enough, if you get out of your house, you should be able to see this anywhere you go. So have you never questioned those who travel? If you get out and see the world, and you'll be able to see this. So Job's counter-argument to the retribution principle brings this classical argument of the relationship between virtue and happiness. So for instance, Aristotle in Nicomachean Ethics argues that the person who is virtuous aims for happiness, and a person who achieves happiness is usually virtuous. So there's equality between virtue and happiness. So if you're righteous, you prosper. The world is set up in such a way that if you work hard, if you try to be good, you are blessed with many goods in your life and you enjoy happiness in this life. I mean, in many cases, this is true. If you do bad things, you should get punished. If you do good things, you should be blessed or you should be rewarded. So, retribution principle as a general guideline of life, this is quite reasonable. This is quite reasonable, and I think many people would like to believe that this is actually the case. And in many cases, we will be able to observe this. If you study hard, right? If you write many entries in your journal, it's very likely that your paper is going to be great, right? So there's correspondence between your virtue and end result, or rewards or happiness at the end of this work, right? But what Job is arguing in chapter 21 is that there is no clear correspondence between virtue and happiness. In fact, Kantian ethics argues this position. Look around, right? The person who is good can be judged by the intentions that the person has. So the integrity The motivations by which people do things are more important than the consequences of their work. And if you pay attention to it, oftentimes people who are wicked prosper in the world, and those who actually try to be good often suffer from unhappiness. So there's no correspondence between happiness and virtue. In fact, what is most important for us to do is to become virtuous, regardless of the fact that we may become unhappy in this life. That's a Kantian argument. They are not mutually exclusive, I don't think, but they represent opposing positions regarding the relationship of virtue and happiness. So once again, retribution principle is something that we aspire to hold on to. The legal system is set up in such a way that we believe that whoever committed a crime should deserve punishment, and whoever served for the good of the community should be recognized and should be rewarded. So the justice should be served, that we should be able to make these clear correspondence between virtue and happiness. That's how the legal system works, right? But what's happening around the world? Black Lives Matter? Have you seen that news around the world? This protest against racism? Because racism is one of the isms that hold on to confirmation bias, right? If you see a white person walking down the street at 11 o'clock at night with hoodie on, we just think that he might be actually jogging. But if the black person is putting a hoodie on and running outside, society thinks differently. That is confirmation bias, because you already decided what you're going to draw as a conclusion, and you're looking at the reality. And oftentimes reality is not what we think it is. So this protest against this racism is to bring in this retribution principle in some way. We want to believe that there's correspondence between virtue and happiness and reality and how we perceive of it. So we want this correspondence between facts and the way we actually observe it. We want to hold on to this justice, and happiness of those who are just should be protected. That's why we are having this notion of justice and peace and prosperity should be corresponding with each other. But oftentimes reality presents a challenging case. Look of hypocrisy. It doesn't have to be political hypocrisy. There's hypocrisy anywhere in the world, and this is a great picture that I could find online. Right, the guy is eating apple. He's looking afar in the sunset or sunrise, I don't know. He looks like healthy. But if you really look down, what is he holding on, right? So you have this image that we interpret immediately without paying attention to the whole picture, often presents something different. In commercial practice, we often represents this blatant contradiction of religiousness and holiness while you're selling these wine, right? So there's a little bit of contradiction between what you're trying to represent, right? You're trying to ease the conscience of the people. At the same time, you're trying to sell them alcohol. I mean, alcohol in itself is not a problem, but you see the blatant shamelessness or contradiction in commercial practice sometimes, right? What you see on the surface is a smile, but what is behind, we don't know, right? There could be a really, really wicked person is smiling at you and trying to take advantage of you. We see this hypocrisy of disjunction between justice and virtue and happiness. The book of Job is definitely posing this challenge to the question of how we can implement justice in our society, and why is it that we are not always seeing the correspondence between virtue and happiness. So once you pay attention to that, we can see how retribution principle is not absolute, and in fact, you might have to rethink that principle such that you'll be able to see me as who I am. So we can become friends again. You'll be able to observe my character as who I am. Okay, let's quickly go through the concluding questions. First question, what are the friends trying to achieve by holding on to the retribution principle? It seems that their insistence on holding on to the retribution principle becomes almost ridiculous, right? As philosophical argument, Bildad or Zophar in the first speech is enough. I don't think the second, third speech are adding anything conceptually. They might be representing significant existential meanings or what language can do to human soul or human existence. You see that the power of language beyond the content, what it can do to the human beings. When a person is going through a suffering, if you say something that is generally true, but it doesn't hold in every case, could actually tear that person into pieces, right? That's what Job said about friends' words, right? But flip side of that phenomena is that I think these friends are trying to hold on to something. They're trying to hold on to the correspondence between virtue and happiness. By holding on to that picture, what are they trying to prove? I think they're trying to prove Job wrong but also in the flip side of it, they're trying to prove something right. You have to think beyond the surface of this argument between Job and his friends. And I think that's the question that we should ask in relation to this retribution principle. What are we trying to achieve by holding on to this retribution principle, even though the world is presenting us something opposite to it? Second question, if the retribution principle is wrong, what are the social consequences of it? So we want to believe that justice is serving in our society, the wicked should be punished and the good should be rewarded. There are some benefit and truth to the fact that the world is set up in such a way that if you do well, happiness awaits you. Or do you think it's completely wrong, the retribution principle, or the ways in which we see the correspondence between virtues and happiness has no ground? So the correspondence between virtue and happiness has no ground whatsoever in philosophy? We've been discussing this since time immemorial. Like since Aristotle, we've been discussing this correspondence between virtue and happiness. And we haven't come to the end of this discussion. And you see the very discussion taking place in the book of Job. So you have to think about this. If we are going to say retribution principle is not absolute, wrong, how is it wrong? Is it wrong all the time or is it wrong sometimes? Whatever that conclusion to that question, what are the social consequences of that assumption? You see the social consequences of believing that retribution principle is absolute. That is lack of compassion and our inability to see that some sufferings could take place without cause. Some people are just going through this just because the world is set up in such a way that this is possible, right? Not because they did something wrong. They could just suffer from certain things. And these are not punishment. They're just contingent, accidental suffering. It's just period. We don't have to put any cause to it. But if you hold on to the retribution principle as the absolute principle, we would have to say every effect, every suffering must have a cause. And that cause would have to be a wickedness in that person. So we have seen the social consequences of holding on to the retribution principle as right. But now the question is, what if it's wrong? And how is it wrong, first of all? And then if it's wrong in that way, what are the consequences of it? Okay, I'm repeating the same question again and again, but this is a very good question and I think you'll be able to provide me with many examples. So I would love to see your reflections on this issue. Okay, third question. What is the point of justice if death brings equality to both good and evil at the end? Job repeatedly asks questions like, look, at the end of the day, we all have to go into this eternal sleep, the sleep that we do not come back from. The Gilgamesh's reflections on the Enkidu of death. If we achieve this eternal fame, we've done many great things, but at the end of the day, when we die, what's the point of it? In fact, evil might win out, right? I've done so many bad things and nobody caught me, and I'm actually rewarded for the bad things that I've done as a good things. And at the end of the day, I'll just go to sleep, just like the person who did everything right, but then suffer from all the misery that you can think of in this life. At the end of the day, if the Job and the friends go to sleep, what's the whole point of holding on to the integrity? This is the ultimate question of justice and being good in terms of ethics. Is there any point in being good or bad? Or is the world is beyond good and evil in such a way that there's no point in imposing these values? This is an existential question that many philosophers asked, and even a book title, right, made to this question, Beyond Good and Evil by Nietzsche. So we have to think about this question of what's the point of all these ethical judgments if philosophy of death tells us that at the end of the day, every ethical decision should be treated equally according to this insight. This will be a topic in philosophy of death. Okay, on that note, I'd like to finish this lecture. Thanks again for listening to this lecture till the end. I hope you are getting this existential heat or like the feeling from reading the book of Job. And we will finish this book in the next lecture. Have a nice weekend and see you next time.